all listeners, near and far, grab a cup of tea and a seat by the fire. I'm your host, Lena Isleifson, and you are tuned in to Pages, a podcast where we walk the line between fact and fiction, between myth and reality, exploring words and how they wind their way into our everyday lives. In September 1999, paragraphs of graffiti appeared overnight on the walls of a warehouse in southern England. The words rocked a worldwide community. Allow me to introduce you to The Vision by Pete Gregg.
So this guy comes up to me and says, "What's the vision? What's the big idea?" I open my mouth and words come out like this. The vision. The vision is Jesus. Obsessively, dangerously, undeniably, Jesus. The vision is an army of young people. You see bones, I see an army. And they are free from materialism. They laugh at 9 to 5 little prisons. They could eat caviar on Monday and crust on Tuesday. They wouldn't even notice. They are mobile like the wind. They belong to the nations. They need no passport. People write their addresses in pencil and wonder at their strange existence. They are free, yet they are slaves of the hurting and dirty and dying. What's the vision? The vision is holiness that hurts the eyes. It makes children laugh and adults angry. It gave up the game of minimum integrity long ago to reach for the stars. It scorns the good and strains for the best. It is dangerously pure. Light flickers from every secret motive, every private conversation. It loves people away from their suicide leaps, their Satan games. This is an army that will lay down its life for the cause. 1,000,000 times a day, its soldiers choose to lose that they might one day win the great well done of faithful sons and daughters. Such heroes are as radical on Monday morning as Sunday night. They do not need fame from names. Instead, they grin quietly upwards and hear the crowd chanting again and again, "Come on!"
Only a week later, the words were quoted by tens of thousands at an event in Washington, D.C. called The Call. 2 years later, the poem would be circulated to 100,000 underground churches in China in a magazine called The Way. The oldest known example of literature in human history dates from around 2500 BC. And guess what? It's poetry. So for more than 4,500 years, humans have been writing poetry. And yet we live in a world where my street interviews go like this. When is the last time you read a poem?
Like 5 years ago, 7 years ago.
In high school.
Probably in like 9th grade English.
Not since high school, probably.
So why, after all this time, has poetry gone from being something inspirational and relatable to being something to be endured in exchange for a high school diploma?
We are given things. We are given interpretations. We have our stories framed for us on demand. We are given things and we're supposed to understand immediately. And I've trained for my entire professional career to read poetry. And what I love most is encountering something and thinking, I don't know what to do with this, right? I'm not sure where to go with this.
That was Jay Gamble, an instructor and poet in the Department of English at the University of Lethbridge. He came into the studio to discuss poetry, and this is our conversation. Are you able to speak a little bit about how you see the role of poetry in the lives of people today, the young people who are coming through your classroom, and how are you seeing them react and interact with poetry?
That's a really interesting question, and in fact, that's often a question I bring to the class to have students begin to think about. Why do they tend not to read poetry outside of the classroom? And certainly in my introductory courses, I use music as a way of encouraging students to sort of see music and musical lyrics as a form of poetry, though at the same time, I wouldn't go so far necessarily as to say lyrics are poetry in the same way that for instance, perhaps Gertrude Stein, that I'll talk about a little bit later, is a poet. And so what I'm finding recently, however, is that a lot of my students are connecting to and indeed writing a lot of politically aware resistance kind of poetry, and looking at poetry as a way of, speaking out against and protesting in many ways the kind of things we see happening in the world today.
Yeah, that's so interesting to bring that up, because I've talked to a couple poets who are also very passionate about their political voices, putting that into a poem. Why do you think poetry is so uniquely suited to that, being that outlet for people?
That's a really good question, and I think one of the reasons is because it is in many ways distilled thought and distilled emotion, and so you're able to kind of capture in a couple of lines or a short stanza larger concepts and ideologies. And so, for instance, when 9/11 happened, people weren't sending around excerpts of novels as a way of comforting themselves or offering comfort to others, but indeed it was poetry, right?
Yeah.
That people were sending out. And I do think in some ways in those moments of tragedy, in those moments of ongoing fascism that we do see in many ways, the way in which poetry can be a powerful tool in the sense that it does distill and crystallize thought in ways that perhaps other forms don't.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And maybe that's a great time to ask you, what is your definition of poetry?
I have a very expansive definition
Okay.
of poetry to the point that I would say whatever a poet frames as poetry is poetry.
Yeah.
One of my a poet that I admire and whose work I admire, I'm quite pleased to say is a friend of mine, Derek Beaulieu, is a visual poet.
Yeah.
And so I bring this in,
Okay.
and it doesn't say anything. It
Yeah.
doesn't have words that we would understand, but it's bordering the line between language and visual art, and so he's framed this as poetry. And so, is it poetry? Absolutely, because
That's
a
so
poet
cool.
has framed it as poetry. So, at the same time, I wouldn't want to say playing the stock market is poetry,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah.
so I think that that there are lines. I don't know that I found them myself, and I find that they tend to shift depending on the work of art that I encounter.
Okay. Would you say it's fundamental to the nature of poetry that it involves beauty?
Well, that's a good question, because I think sometimes poetry takes on things that are ugly,
Yeah.
and it represents things that are horrific.
For sure.
Does it do so in a beautiful way? It can, but it can also do things in discordant ways where the
Yeah.
meter is off or where
Yeah.
the language clangs.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of poetry has to do with beauty, but I think that a lot of poetry can also investigate the dark and the ugly as well. Yeah.
So I'm wondering how you see the way we interact with poetry. How are we interacting with poetry differently now versus when the poets that have brought us here, when they were writing?
That's, again, a really good question, and it does kind of get into the history of poetry. And so you look back after the Gutenberg Revolution with the printing press and so on, when people, and education, when people began to become more literate, and poetry was incredibly popular. And so it was just recently Robbie Burns Day, and I'm Scottish, and so you've got a nation that actually has a celebration of a poet that's deeply connected to their national identity as well, and very much a kind of a folk poet as well, right? Folk songs and that kind of thing. But then you look at, say, Byron, who is, you could consider him to some extent to be the first rock star, right?
Yeah.
That he was this incredibly popular poet. And now I think, if you say he's a famous poet or she's a famous poet, it's kind of the same thing as saying he's a famous bowler, like you don't, unless you're involved in the sport of bowling, unless you're involved in poetry, it's not something that is widely understood in culture. So,
Yeah. That's really interesting. And so you brought a couple poems from poets that you admire, and are you willing to read some of that?
Absolutely.
That would be great.
So this is a poet that I'm particularly interested in, just in the work that I'm doing. And although this poem itself is not one that is directly influencing me, it's one I come back to again and again and again.
Yeah.
And this is a German poet by the name of Rainer Maria Rilke, translated by Stephen Mitchell. And its title is just its first line, "You who never arrived. You who never arrived in my arms, beloved, who were lost from the start. I don't even know what songs would please you. I've given up trying to recognize you in the surging wave of the next moment. All the immense images in me, the far-off, deeply felt landscape, cities, towers and bridges, and unsuspected turns in the path. and those powerful lands that were once pulsing with the life of the gods, all rise within me to mean you, who forever elude me. You, beloved, who are all the gardens I have ever gazed at, longing, an open window in a country house, and you almost stepped out, pensive, to meet me. Streets that I have chanced upon, you had just walked down them and vanished. And sometimes, in a shop, the mirrors were still dizzy with your presence and, startled, gave back my too sudden image. Who knows? Perhaps the same bird echoed through both of us yesterday, separate, in the evening.
That is beautiful.
Yeah, he's fantastic.
Yeah,
yeah.
that's amazing. And so what about that poem? Has you say hasn't directly inspired you, but you keep coming back to it. Why is that?
It's a haunt. I mean, it is about a haunting, and one of my intellectual, scholarly preoccupations is absence and nothingness. And so, in fact, I taught recently at an entire seminar on literature and nothingness. And so this is very much a poem about absence and about longing and even about the speaker is talking about someone he's never met and but imagines could be out there. So this kind of imagined absence and the longing that emerges or that arrives when you encounter what could be or what could have been.
Yeah, I love that line about the mirror being startled to have the wrong reflection in it. Like,
absolutely,
that is
yeah. His turn of phrase is just brilliant.
Yeah, it's something that I admire so much about poetry, and the poetry that really resonates with me, that you can find a way to describe something so ordinary in such a it just gives it a new angle, and it kind of brings life to ordinary, everyday things we experience but don't have the words for.
Absolutely, and in a lot of ways, what poetry does is articulate what can't be articulated. I think you were alluding to exactly that, right? It speaks the unspeakable in some ways.
For sure.
Yeah.
Where do you think the power lies in poetry, and why is it that poets are the ones that speak out? Why is poetry a medium for rebellion?
Ooh, that is a huge question. And I don't want to reduce poetry to sloganeering or to anything like that. But I do think when you can distill, when you can crystallize resistance through a couple of lines, even through rhyme, that's where its power lies. And in producing images that are powerful, right? And in framing news stories about the murder of good or what have when you frame simply a news story or a video that we've seen hundreds of times into an artistic medium, when you do that and frame it not just as news but as something significant and as something worthy of remembering and something worthy of recognizing the fascism that's happening in the States, that I think poetry then is able to frame it in such a way that the poets are able to speak back to that kind of power. I don't want to say that poetry is this magical cure-all and it's going to save the world or anything, because I think that power has a very clear pattern of simply disregarding poetry and art, or indeed murdering the artists, right? Sure. I mean, that's the history of resistance. It's the poets and thinkers and philosophers who are the first ones up against the wall in the revolution, right? So, but that also, I think, is an indication that power recognizes power, right? Power recognizes the voice of art, and so in those attempts to silence it, I think we can see that there is that recognition of it. But I do think that it's, with this absolute deluge of information and memes and videos and Facebook posts and Twitter, whatever is out there, we're just deluged all the time. And I think one of the things that art can do is make us pause and say, okay, here's something that we need to take a look at from this massive amount of information and disinformation. Here's something that we need to focus on. Here's something we need to think about. And so maybe that's how it's shifting in some ways, is that it's forcing us to slow down. It's forcing us to pause and to look and to maintain eye contact and say, this is something that we need to focus on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've had people talk about the fact that poetry is not is kind of inherently harder to connect with than other art forms or even just other forms of entertainment like like songs. It's hard to digest because it's poetic and the words don't necessarily mean what they're saying, and it's sometimes it takes some work, but that means that you are pausing. It means that you are listening.
Part of the reason poetry is difficult is because you need to be trained in it, right? And in some ways you need to be trained in music as well to be able to hear the message. But we're just so inundated with music all of the time that it becomes sort of second nature. But as I tell my students, when you're up in your bedroom trying to figure out what Taylor Swift is meaning, you're engaged and engaged in sort of a critical thinking and interpretation. It's just now that you need to focus instead on perhaps meter or perhaps rhyme or perhaps figures of speech in ways that perhaps you don't with story. But I kind of want to turn this a little bit on you, and this is wonderful to see, a young person particularly interested in poetry having a podcast on poetry. So what is it that's drawn you to poetry in this peculiar moment in a way that it might be considered to be perhaps a dying art? What is it that's drawn you to this?
As you said earlier, that's a big question. I've been writing poetry since I was little, and so I think words and the power of storytelling has always been something that's really struck me as a super interesting thing and really powerful. So much potential there with the way that we're kind of wired to react to stories. I think it makes us listen, it makes us remember, it makes us care more than anything else. And so poetry being one side of that, as I've gotten older, I've been writing more and different and thinking about it a little more. And even just in the past couple months, realizing the fact that I feel as if we're less connected to poetry. I'm not sure if everyone would agree with that, but I feel like our society as a whole is less connected to poetry. And I started to wonder, what are we missing now? Talking to you, talking to other poets about their work, I just think that it's so undervalued. Talking to people who don't write poetry, it's like, oh, I read it in high school maybe, and it's kind of interesting, I guess, but I don't really intend to read it. And I understand that because it can be confusing and people don't like what they can't understand. And sometimes the point isn't to understand, the point is to feel. And I just feel kind of frustrated by the fact that people don't care. I think it's beautiful the way that we can take words and paint a picture. It's like abstract art in word form, and you get something so unique from that. It's a way to cope with life. It's a way to process life. It's a way to celebrate life. It's a way to understand life. And we are kind of lacking in understanding at the moment in the world from what I've seen. And so, like you said, we listening, slowing down, looking outside ourselves feels like a really valuable skill at the moment. And so
this is so wonderful to hear. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, now I'm as guilty as the next person,
sure.
scrolling through my phone and doom scrolling and so on, right?
Yeah.
And then you pause and you read Rilke maybe, or, Croce or Gertrude Stein or these phenomenal poets. And it does force you to stop and think. And for me, that's what I love about poetry is poetry that I don't get.
Yeah.
Right? Because then I'm like, what? Okay.
Yeah.
Why don't I get this? I know what those words mean, but altogether I don't. And then an hour goes by and I'm like, wow, I just spent an hour reading 14-line sonnet.
I get the feeling that people find it intimidating and inaccessible because they don't know how to respond to it. And you mentioned earlier that you need training to appreciate poetry and to start to engage with it. And I'm not sure if we're getting that training these days, generally speaking. And I think it might discourage people because they feel like there's something to overcome in order to break through and connect with it. And so they don't try to experience it because they just assume they won't be able to.
That's a really, really good point. And I'm beginning to think a little bit as you're talking there about we are given things, right?
Yeah.
We are given interpretations. We are given. We have our stories framed for us on demand. We are given things and we're supposed to understand immediately. And as I said, I've trained for my entire professional career to read poetry. And what I love most is encountering something and thinking, I don't know what to do with this, right? I'm not sure where to go with this. And then I become curious, right? And maybe, and I don't want to condemn a generation or, kids these days, but there does seem to be in many cases, in many instances, a kind of lack of curiosity. And again, I think it does come down to this inundation of information and through social media and so on.
What do you think we're missing out on
I'm gonna sound perhaps mystical here, but being in the moment,
Yeah.
you know, and simply existing in the moment. Boy, I really am going to start getting mystical here,
ahead.
but recognizing the beauty just of existence, right? Of being in that moment, of appreciating that moment, of appreciating life, and it's difficult, right? Like the news from the States, the news from
Yes.
you know, it's really like I have to take time away from that because I cannot be flooded and I cannot emotionally invest in all of these horrible stories that are coming out and
100%.
Palestine and Ukraine and I mean all of these places around the world where there's this absolute devastation and absence of humanity and it's difficult to say, you know what, life is good, life in its existence is simply good, and so maybe that's what art does, is in this kind of peaceful kind of resistance, allow us to now I'm rambling and I don't know
No,
if I'd be
keep
able to
going.
support this later
Yeah.
on. But there is, I think, this sense that poetry forces us to appreciate what's present before us. In many cases.
Yeah.
And also in many cases it forces us to think about and to address those ugly parts as
Yeah.
well, right?
Earlier, I asked you if you think that beauty is fundamental to poetry. Would you say that humanity is fundamental to poetry?
The reason I'm drawn to poetry is because there is a human behind the words, right? And it is connecting with another human 300 years ago
Yeah.
who once lived, and it is connecting in a different way from just our everyday sort of passing a stranger in the street or what have you. And so that's part of the reason I love it. But a lot of the work that I enjoy refuses the creative element or the human element and incorporates technology and so on. And I enjoy sort of looking at the way in which language itself speaks. So what do you think then is...
The role of poetry?
Yeah.
Just in our lives? Or
Yeah.
It's slowing down, being willing to step out of the rushing stream of time and information and attention grabbing things and sit in a moment. I think it is listening, being able to look at something outside yourself, learning how to relate to other people in that listening, connecting to other people, learning how to take time listening and understanding as well. I think honest, like, humanity is what it comes down to. And I think that's probably why it connects so well to what I've seen people talk about when it comes to poetry versus political power, because political power dehumanizes and poetry
Right.
humanizes.
Brilliant.
When it comes to listening, it's when we're most human that we can listen to each other, when we're at our most vulnerable. I feel like poetry has that ability to also help us see beauty in the mundane as well, and understand ourselves as well as other people. I've found that I've written down things that I didn't know I was thinking when I'm
Right.
writing poetry, and it seems to me that it comes from a place that's so raw and deep. It takes courage to step inside that space because you don't know what you're going to find there. And then to share that additionally is another step that I think just really brings connection.
Yeah, I'm delighted to hear you say that. And
Yeah.
I was particularly struck when you said that you wrote things that you didn't even realize you were thinking. And that makes me curious. So what is your writing process? How is it that unconscious perhaps
Yeah.
burbles to the surface? What is it that you're doing to allow that?
I find that once I feel something, whether it's positive or negative, those feelings demand to go somewhere. And I recently have been writing poetry more. One of the poems that I wrote talked about sitting and wondering about the right angle to let the light shine through when you're writing something, and it feels like that. It feels like you know that it's there. It's almost like it already exists, but you just have to find it. Like you're catching butterflies. It's there, but you just have to learn the language. You have to figure out how to coax it down into your pen. And I think in that process of trying to economize on words and meanings and kind of condense it and distill it into a poem. My poems are not usually very long. Truth ends up showing up, coming to the table.
Yes, yeah.
To
Oh,
talk.
yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's like, that's, I don't know, it's a bit of an abstract way of talking about it, but usually I write and I edit. Sometimes my best poetry is just, I wrote it and it's already great, in my eyes anyways. So, but sometimes it takes, like, revisiting it. I get so excited to revisit my poetry that I'm still working on because it's like a puzzle. I'm trying to get the pieces to fit together, right? And I know that there's an answer. I just need to find it. And so it's kind of an adventure that way, I'd say.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Northrop Frye, I can't believe I'm bringing up Northrop Frye, but Northrop Frye says that the reason a poet can't say what but what she means is not because she doesn't know what she's talking about, but for the very same reason that an artist can't, right? That a visual artist can't, that a painter can't, that a painter's not standing by the painting and going, actually what this mountain represents is this, right? And so what he's saying is that it's art, and it's not supposed to be explicable in the same way an essay or a news article is or anything like that, that it's a work of art, which means it requires interpretation and so on. And I think the important thing is to come to the poem understanding what the poem is trying to do and not make the poem do what you want it to do,
Sure.
right? And so
humbly.
yeah, exactly, right? Approach it and sort of say, hey, you know what? This is a free verse lyric poem. It may not be exactly what my particular interests are, but this is what it's doing, and it's doing it in this particular way. Or this is visual poetry, and it doesn't have words on it, but it's got it's got lines and squiggles, and it draws pictures with letters and so on. And it doesn't do what I want it to do as a poem. But I think if we, again, I think your notion of humility and sort of approaching it and saying, okay, and maybe even not humility, but perhaps even just curiosity.
I love
right?
that. Yeah, curiosity for sure.
And with curiosity, though, comes humility, right?
Yeah.
Because what you're saying in many ways is, I don't know. Right,
Yeah.
and that's vulnerable. That's
For
a moment. But that's what poetry is. It should be, in many cases, discomforting. Right, it should make you uncomfortable, and whether that's because of the topic and the issues that it's addressing, or whether it's because, geez, I don't know what this is doing.
Yeah.
Right, that education occurs at that moment of discomfort.
I
right?
love it.
Right?
Yeah,
because
that's great.
what it's doing is it's pushing at the edge of your knowledge. And that's uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
Because it's actually saying you may not know everything that you think you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And so if we look at poetry as perhaps a form of education, then it should poke a little bit and make us a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, because growth isn't comfortable.
No, exactly,
Yeah.
right? Growing pains, we all get them,
Exactly.
right? Yes.
And so my last question for you is, what's your message for people who are listening to this and maybe don't have a lot of experience with poetry, haven't interacted with it, haven't explored it, haven't even considered reading a poem in the past 20 years? Like, what would your message kind of to the world be about poetry and its importance, its role?
You're already there. You already love poetry. One fish, two fish, blue fish, red fish, blue fish. You love poetry when you were a kid. You're listening to Taylor Swift. You're listening to Bad Bunny. You're listening to poetry, and now it's just a sort of, you're invited. That's the thing I think that people don't feel invited to poetry, and I'm inviting you, and the poet is inviting you. Even if it is difficult, the poet is inviting you to be curious about what it is that they have to say, and also at the same time, be comfortable with your discomfort, right? And allow yourself to be challenged, and be curious. Above all, be curious.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that so much. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank
I
you.
really
Yeah.
appreciate your well thought out and passionate answers.
Well, thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah.
And again, once again, I'm honored to have been asked. So thank you very much for inviting me on this podcast. And you've done a fantastic job.
Thank you
It
so
was
much.
been a wonderful conversation, and really, really enjoyed it. So thanks, Lena.
Thanks for spending some time with me on Pages. As always, I hope you feel inspired to look at the world a little differently. I encourage you to explore the world of words, dive into some good stories, and maybe even tell your own. Be sure to catch our next episode, same time, same place. I'm your host, Lena Isleifson. The end.